This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. Today is Sunday, August the 18th, 2019, and this is the Prairie Monk program, WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails, greenways, conservation, and everything else that Dave has been up to. What have you been up to, Dave?
Quite a bit. I wanted to say a little entree to my talk today. We tend to have done quite a few things and not necessarily put ourselves out in front of doing this. We often transfer to other agencies, and there was the assumption that they can do better, and often they can because they're specialists. And but I find people often put in many hours of do-it work and don't necessarily get credit for it from the surrounds, because that's natural, and you really want to see the surrounds do successful things. But sometimes I want to encourage people to be out there. It's a little bit difficult to politic, but get out there and say what you're doing and what you might want to do. We haven't been too backward in saying what we want to do, but we sometimes have left what we have done in the background. So today I want to say something about just this last week and some of the associations that make things interesting and possible. To start with, we advertised on the air last week teasel removal in Rantoul, and Liz Kirby had kindly put up a note on Facebook, and that did draw some people and other people she knew. And so on Monday morning, a number of people went up to Rantoul direct, because they like to work early in the morning when the temperature's not high. But then Ron Sleater came by, and we had advertised for 9 o'clock. We didn't pick up any extra people there, but in the long run we had 6 people working on the prairie. And on the way, we encountered, we went to Chief Samogga Park. It's over on east side of Urbana, next to the Park District maintenance buildings. And it is a forested area that has a lot of honeysuckle and other not indigenous but invasive plants that take away from the dignity of a forest. And she's been working there, and so we visited there. Then we went to the Pope Prairie, and there's some debate. Should you clean up one area, or should you go for the teasel that is the main invasive plant? The autumn olive is there, but it takes time to change dimensions and take a lopper and get rid of a autumn olive. There's parsnip. And parsnip, we don't worry about a great deal because it can become invasive, but when you have a reasonably strong prairie, it's not going to be too much of a problem. Some of the invasives can't compete with an established prairie. The other alternative is to harvest the seed pods independently and carry some sort of container on your belt that you can, so that you can free both hands, and then pick into a small container, which you then put into a bigger bag, and we take those seed heads out, and we're lucky to have to try and get rid of these seed heads. They really need to be incinerated. I've tried the university, which has an incinerator. We have tried the funereal people who have incinerators, and without success. Burn piles are good enough. Well, this time we tried just putting them on the old Route 45 and adding gasoline to them. But even so, this is early in the year, and they're green pods. And that's part of the objective of what we try to do, is to take the heads off while the seeds are in the milk stage and they're not going to be reproducing. So we cautiously spot herbicide the plant. It has a huge rosette that denies prairie. It tends to be in organic matted areas where there's enough room for roots and enough fertility. So it's not really in the gravel pit area where the prairie is coming back by a regrowth succession, and it has deep roots, and it's small compared with a normal prairie. A rosinweed, which might normally be about 4 feet high, can be 10 inches high, and give it time, it will recreate little areas of organic matter, and gradually come back to a prairie. The teasel can then take advantage of that. So there are a few teasels on the main prairie, but mostly the teasels are around where this soil was not borrowed. Borrowing is a term that's sort of obsolete. If you have a gravel pit, you borrow the gravel and to put in a side road while you fix up a bridge or something like that, and then you return the gravel to the gravel pit, and not so, but that's where the name comes from. It's a borrow pit or a gravel pit. So the crew that came was knowledgeable in this invasive creature, and they did an excellent job of taking a pair of secateurs and cutting the heads off. They came with gloves, because this is a prickly creature, and they soon accumulated a large amount of seed that we were working with later. We have now the advantage of access on both ends of the area that we have, 9 acres. There's an old Route 45, and the north end has had a gate, and now the south end has a gate, and that's very helpful. So we can get vehicles in there and get tools in there. We don't have to walk them in. So I want to advertise that we'll do that again on Monday. People who know where they're going and they do, can go there, and they have a key to the gate, and they can drive in on that corridor. So 9 a.m. here, Ron Sleater will come by from Decatur, and we'll leave here because that seems to be a reasonable time to leave from here. But the other workers are already in action. Ron is concerned that every teasel that produces seed will be eliminated, and he uses a wire whip to cut the plant. So there's a difference between the two types of harvest. The wire whip, we're not too worried about dropping the plant on the site. It's too juvenile to be able to seed, and it will rot steadily. If you have enough workers, you can take that top out onto the road, pods and all, and remove the pods later. Just different techniques for different people, and they're both quite useful. Where it's kind of rough and tough, like on the roadside on Route 45, we tend to wire whip. Where we have a battery of a teasel, then we tend to do the decapitation, and then there's a question of, do you leave the stalk, which is about 8 feet tall, and that's a matter of debate. But if you leave it, it still grows. It's still photosynthetic, and it can encourage sprouts at the bottom, and that happens. If you cut it off and harvest that already harvested plant, you can save some of that continuing activity. So that's another matter for who does what, when, and how. At the moment, we tend to leave that one standing and hope that it doesn't generate too many tillers or young shoots from the bottom. In fall, we go through and get those more recent additions to the corridor. For most volunteers, especially early in the day, 2 hours is a good time. Even half an hour is a help, but 2 hours seems to be a good figure. And if you're working with the master naturalists, that may be volunteer time. You have to do with that program 60 hours of volunteer work. But otherwise, we're quite prepared to do some payment to get rid of that noxious weed. And we've been at it for 7 years, and it's doing pretty well. So teasel removal is good, and we'll put a link at the end of this program to give you an idea of the two different types of harvest. Not too complex, it's just that it helps to know what you're doing. Next thing I want to say something about is the Oakwood Trail. And, I said something about it last week, but I continue to be involved with that trail. There will be a Syriac event today. Kevin Green is organizing a field trip to Kickapoo State Park. You go to the maintenance building. You have to go into Danville a little bit and then take a road to the left and perhaps find your way west to the maintenance division, not too hard. And then they will hike for an hour and then go back to Kevin's place where he has a swimming pool, and he trains people how to scuba dive. And so Kevin is a member of the Sierra Club, and often they have fundraisers and the like at Sleepy Hollow, which is just south of Oakwood. So if you go today, you go there at 2 o'clock and take your swimmers if you want to enjoy the pool that Kevin has, which is a very great help in his training of people how to scuba dive. The next thing I want to report on is working with the Forest Preserve. I had a meeting on Thursday night, and I usually don't like to go to a meeting and make pronouncements without I've contacted the president or people that are involved. And so I did that, and we met up before the meeting, and so Sarah Livesey, who's the president, knew roughly what I wanted to say. And what I wanted to say is that we have between St. Joe and Oakwood a lot of land that looks rough and tough. It has trees and shrubs growing on it, and it doesn't look like it means very much, but it's the land on either side of the ballast of the railroad, and it's rich in original soil and rich in prairie plants if you allow them to express themselves. That may take a few years, but I wanted to say that we took out a interim trail use with the federal government. It was after we had worked with 33 miles in the Monticello area, and without a rail banking act. The Rail Banking Act is where the railroads were, or the public was feeling that there were too many railroads being taken out. And in order to save them, they noticed that bikers and hikers and natural history people were preserving those trails, buying the railroad bed, and they had some problems. One is that the bridges were taken out by federal mandate, so nobody committed suicide off them or anything like that. And the other thing was that the federal government decided it would quiet the titles, so you didn't have to come to the hog farm and find that it was a warranty deed for the farmer and could be taken back. So that Rail Banking Act we took advantage of and took out a docket with the Surface Transportation Board. We were also very aware that there were original ecologists, Coles and others, in the Chicago area that were preserving the dignity of dunes and Lake Michigan. And Cole's daughter, May Watts, of Reading the Landscape fame, she has a book which is very popular, and she noticed that these railroads were coming out, and she wanted to write a letter to the Tribune, which she did, to suggest that these trails could be natural areas and trails. And it took off, and in the Chicago area there are a lot of rail trails as a result, and the vegetation is there. When we went to do that with the Surface Transportation Board between Urbana and Danville, we were wanting that vegetation on the side. We assumed that we would, the Act supports not only hiking and biking, but the vegetation on either side. The first phase didn't really work that well because it was made very wide, and with 8 inches of capping to cap the possibility of remaining creosote, and that went down the side. And there was also some transportation invasion of the corridor for road widening, but the trail is wide enough to be appreciated by the ADA, American Disabilities Act, and between EPA and ADA and some of the funding, that trail was very, very wide and took out original prairie that many of us had used for teaching, and especially those people who were the early progenitors of ecological union. Vestals, Kendi, and I'm forgetting the other guy, but they encouraged George Fell to go off to Washington and create the Nature Conservancy. Well, we've got that 7 miles. We've lost that little bit of history. It's nice and wide for ADA, and EPA is pleased that they've capped the creosote not only on the ballast but down on the bed. Now, but we're suggesting that there was very good prairie from the very east side of St. Joe along to a bridge over the Union Pacific and on to Ogden and on to Rumpler. At Rumpler, the Forest Preserve, which owns the bed in Champaign County, it changes to ownership of the Vermilion County Conservation District, Preservation District. The two organizations are a little different in that there's more mandate for recreation in the Forest Preserve principle and less so in the Preservation Conservation District. So our suggestion is that you don't make the trail so wide that you don't have any ambiance on the side, that you don't have the gene pool that you need for future generations, that you make a rail trail that is fairly narrow. And so that was my presentation to the Forest Preserve. Let's look at this now before it gets set in concrete. It's not going to change anything once the plan is instituted. So what people do we have to work with? First of all, there's the Surface Transportation Board, which is more or less the Transportation Department of the federal government. It doesn't really care what happens with the rail trail as long as the corridor is kept intact with contiguity and that the train could come back if necessary. That's where $12 million is coming to preserve that corridor, and that's the principle. That means that most of the organization and the control rests with the state Department of Transportation, which is responsible for alternate forms of transportation, i.e. Biking and hiking. The Nature Preserves Commission. The Department of Natural Resources comes in there with the Nature Preserves Commission as a part of it, and as a bicycle organization. And there in those groups there is some politicking and debate. There is a fairly heavy involvement by engineering. Drainage is important. There's not as much involvement by biologists or geneticists that are looking at the preservation of this corridor. It's not the world's greatest. It's what we have, and it's local. You may have a better preservation site in Amboy or some other place that has happened to be preserved as a railroad bed, but it's what we have local, and not everyone is going to go up and go to Iowa or somewhere to look for a prairie. So this is what you have locally. So can it be narrow enough for just 2 bicycles to pass? And it could be 4 feet, it could be 8 feet. 8 feet is getting wide. You don't really have to have 8 feet to pass a bicycle. So I presented this idea and begged for this to be considered before it was set in stone. I was pleased to be there, and when you're there, you get to meet people and understand their limitations or what the controls that they have to deal with. Mike Dabb is the biologist, and he's done a very good job. And he's now got a job with the university and is leaving. So we need to be able to work with the administration headed by Mary Ellen Wallner, and just knowing how this organization works and how we might be able to work with it is important. And I'm encouraging you to be out there, not only removing teasel, but to be meeting with friends and relatives and thinking about the overall organization that goes behind this. The next thing I want to report on is the taste of champagne. It's very interesting. It's very popular, and it does well. We had something to do with this a long time ago. We started off with out in the park with 6 people. Gertrude Wiseman and Mork, Evan Mork, and Lucille Ziroli, myself, and someone else who did Rococo, which is sort of working with ceramics, and it's a crackling technical sort of interesting way of doing ceramics. We did that. We also did a thing called Art in the Park that had was a little bit more recreational. We borrowed a band shell, and people came and sat. And I had been used to dancing to music, and I thought that I would like to see some people dancing to this music. So I went and got 30 yards of muslin and strung it around a little bit, rather rudely, but it got people up and they were dancing. It didn't end up to be as successful as I thought it might be, because the small children got into the dancing too, and that was like having to have a lot of adult people with small children, and small children enjoy this, but they can sometimes be endangered. The challenge for art in the park is that it's vulnerable to the environment. One of the things is that if you park your artwork under a tree, the tree may have guttation pores and drop glucose on your artwork. So it means you really have to have a tent. And if you're going to have rain, that's another thing. So juried art has a problem with open space. You really need to have an indoor facility. So the art was also, the art in the park was also more or less relaxed into craftsmanship. So a lot of craft people. And then food was added and drink was added. So this was not really the place for juried art. The juried art was invited to go to Neal Street, but it still had the elements of craft and non-juried art, and it didn't work so well on Neal Street. So then it got dropped altogether. So we don't have an art in the park anymore. We do have a Boneyard Festival, but that's where you go to people's studios. It's not quite the same event. It's an interesting event, and it's helpful, but we do need some sort of place where artists can express themselves with other artists and meet and exchange. There were visitors that have come to the Taste of Champagne. One of them was Mark Rubel, and David met up with that Mark Rubel for a while, and he's been gone from next door to us as a person who designs and operates and teaches about recording methods. He's gone to Nashville. Is very pleased with being there, but he was back in town. He is part of a group of musicians that are the Captain Rats and the Blind Rivets, and he saw me there, and we met up with Nancy, his wife, and she hasn't been back for 5.5 years either. So there was a contact. There was Liz Routnick and her 2 children, a son who has already been a year with the University of Illinois, and a daughter who is looking to decide whether to go to whatever institution. And that was interesting to enjoy their involvement. It was Liz has graduated from here and been an associate in redundancy within the advanced computation level, and she continues to do that work along with her husband, and the family is continuing in that vein. But while here, Liz has been working with natural history, and she has put together dockets associated with the Pope Prairie. And interestingly, a member of the Pope family, Clayton Pope, came along, and Liz was able to say she was associated with that. And Clayton knows now that the burrow pit, or the prairie that he owned and we bought, is in its prime as far as visual Leatrice is up at the moment, and I can't seem to capture it really. And it's with photography. It's better if you go, and so I'm encouraging you to go to the Pope Prairie. The Pope Prairie was so named because the road moves out around the cemetery, the modern 45 road, out around the cemetery, and that leaves an area that could be borrowed for road pack. We're on at the advanced edge of the Bloomington Moraine, so you're going up a slight hill, and that's where there was a moraine that dropped gravel, and it's excellent road pack. So we in effect bought a borrow pit, but Titan has continued to be interested, probably a little intrigued that this was a natural history interest, and he also sold another plot to an Easter family, and they have in turn sold 6 acres to a cemetery which is nearby, and we hope that we might get the remnant area, farmland in between, and convert it to a reconstruction prairie. The reconstruction prairie won't be as good as the remnant prairie, just because the remnant would have more bacteria and fungi and more plants to find niches and things like that. So we would have both, but the reconstruction prairie could give people an introduction to prairie, a little bit like our pocket prairie, so that they could get an idea, and that would take the pressure off of having people to visit the more natural prairie just to the north. So we're thinking about that. I was walking around. There was WEF was there, and talking to people, and there was a Woodrum person who owns farmland in the Oakwood area. So we talked back and forth quite a bit quickly, but I was with visitors, so I didn't stay very long. But I came back later in the night when my visitor had moved on, and talked to him again. And the hope is that people that are in that general area of Bronson, which is just about a mile short of Oakwood, and near the Conkey Town and the Pollywogs and Mission Field, where there was strip mining, and there's all sorts of interesting natural history and cultural history there. Where did the miners come from? They came more or less from Kentucky and Tennessee. So if you have an event in Danville, you can actually know the background of the people that are there. You can get to know the geology which is underneath, and that's why the coal is there, because there's accumulation of Carboniferous era material that got compacted and gives you a coal. You don't see that as easily, so it's not a spectacular feature like the Grand Canyon. It's underneath, and when you find some of the forested area that was compacted, and you allow it to oxidize, it disintegrates very quickly. So it's not a sort of thing that you can have a museum about easily. So we talked, and I talked to a Mulligan tree source person, and that's difficult for us, because forests sometimes are being planted on what used to be prairie soils, and we would like to suggest that prairie would be more appropriate, and the Forest Preserve and the Conservation District have put in prairies, and we appreciate that effort, and some of them are rather large prairies. And in Danville, Doris Westfield collected seed between Oakwood and Bronson, and I really don't want to see that prairie, that the remnant on either side and what's crept up on the ballast that has been vacant for 20 years. I don't want to see that destroyed. So the suggestion is that we have a narrow trail that it be 4 foot wide. This is not a territory where your bicyclists are using it as a bedroom community, like St. Joe is a bedroom community for Champaign. So many people that are used to ride a vehicle to town ride a bicycle to town. So the wide trail is helpful in that respect. But this could be a narrow trail. And we talked about that some. There was a Black Chamber of Commerce that is interesting. Can you put that together? It's very difficult to work with the black community, and you have to be tremendously sympathetic with their attempts to survive as a body. So now there are some upcoming events. One is that I would like you to go to see the Leatrice. It's just 1 mile north of Rantoul, and you go to the first section road north of a road that goes out around the cemetery, and then you'll find a little yellow gate, and you can park to the north and walk in. If people are working there and the gate is open, you're welcome to drive in and find a borrow pit and enjoy it. The plants will be smaller, and the gravel will be there. And it's a nice little stream that goes through it. It's sort of a braided, which means that the stream breaks into several different dimensions and sometimes goes underground. But it provides a wetland part of the prairie. And prairie was, wetlands were very common in this area. This was one of the last counties developed because of that. So think about visiting the Pope Prairie, and there's a WEF coming up, and I think it's the 18th of September. Sleepy Creek Art Gallery will be in Danville on September 28th and 29th. There's a Bob Hutt Memorial at Virginia Theatre at September 28th. There's a Monticello Festival. And there's a Monticello Railroad Museum. And we may be watching that because it's also associated with the Havana and Western Railroad, where we were trying to re-rail between Whiteheath and Seymour and Bonneville and into town. It may take generations to get the complete connection, but it's there. And I'd also like to remind you that today at 2 o'clock, the Sierra Club has a hike led by Kevin Green, and it will meet at the maintenance shed in the Kickapoo State Park. Remember also that on Monday we will have volunteers to remove teasel at Rantoul, removing teasel before it gets ripe and drops seed. So if you possibly can help us with that, that would be very good. People who know and want to work early, like on Saturday, Liz and other people were there at I think 6 o'clock in the morning, and then it began to rain at more or less like 8 o'clock. So, but just being there and helping is saying to the people who might be wanting to use that area to dump trash and things that we care. And the people who control the cemetery worked with Liz to say, we have a gate now and we have a key. And just that is healthy to know, even if you only just visit to see the Leatrice and the prairie and know what it's about, is good. We'll try to put up some links. One will deal with decapitation by taking a pair of secateurs and dropping the heads and storing them in bags and taking them out. The other is the wire whip technique, where you just drop the plant on the ground where it is. It's a little rougher and tougher, but it gets plants might seed. And we'll also probably have something to do to let you see what the Leatrice is doing at the present time. So links will help. So I think I've got about a few minutes left. And I would like to say something. Last week I was saying something about some of the original settler crafts that we have around, and we were talking about making bricks. And we have some of those old bricks. And so we'll also have from time to time spoken about creating lumber, to have a pit and a 10-foot saw and a man underneath in the pit and one on top, making slabs. So there's the wood industry and the carpentry industry and the creation of cabins that often was rounded logs, but sometimes they had to have been mortised and they had to be kept together in an era without nails, so you had to have pegs to hold the building together. And so we have that sort of situation. It was the Barnhart family in Atwood, where there is a log cabin home, a frame home, and an Italianate brick, a mansion, and a bungalow type site, which is more modern. All those sites are within half a mile of each other. We also have from time to time spoken about the transportation. The early settlers came up the rivers, and they were aware that they could travel in a flooded time. It meant a lot of energy to do that, but you wouldn't be there's enough room for the water for you to not have to drag your canoe over gravel areas. Quite a deal of meandering, which meant the trip was slow, but some of those meanders were cut across so that paddle wheelers could work. Paddle wheelers don't need a lot of draft, so they could go way up the Mississippi, way up the Missouri, and you still had to be very careful of how you did that, because if you had the last rain and it dried up and there was a drought, you were stuck with your paddle wheeler in the middle of Montana or somewhere where you didn't really want to be. You'd have to wait till the next season of snowfall to melt to give you enough water to move your ship. Then came canals. So you had canals that came from New York through to to places like Erie, or went from Chicago across to the Quad Cities. And you had a draft, it may be 4 feet or 8 feet, enough to have a barge and a tow corridor along each side where you could have a horse team to pull that barge along. Sometimes there was motorization, but mostly it was by animal. Unfortunately, those corridors were just getting into action when railroads came along. And railroads had the capacity to move through country that didn't have water. And so we're still working with these sorts of transportations. At the moment, the Mississippi has had so much water that the locks cannot be worked. So there is a considerable amount of grain that is tied up with the river not being negotiable. It's part to do with the river is made negotiable by having locks, and those locks back up the water so you can take your tow train to the end of this dam, and then you encounter a lock that you take your tow train into the lock, and then you shut a gate behind you and you let water from the other side fill up, and the tow train lifts up in the air and gets to be the next level. And that's how you get over a hill or a range, is having a series of these locks. And I think this Mississippi has something like 29 of these locks. And part of their problem is that they need maintenance, and sometimes that has not been done. So in the near future, I think some 6 locks will be taken out of action for a period so that they can be repaired. There's a limit of the size that you can use to get through these locks, but they're essential. There's another thing that's a problem with that sort of transportation is that people put up levees. So there's a levee around New Orleans, there's a levee in many places, and sometimes people put up their own levees. And more or less that lifts the river up in the air some. And if those levees break, then they can flood their surrounding bottomlands.
There's actually a 2-part series that the Prairie Rivers Network people have put out talking about levees. The problem is, if you have a levee that's a certain height, that's great for your community. It means that the water won't, if for example, the Mississippi floods, but your levee is high enough, okay, your town is spared. What you're doing is you're pushing that extra water down to the next place where the levees aren't high enough, and then they flood. So what happens? Well, they build their levees higher. Well, they weren't given permission to, but they've been doing it anyway. And now they're pushing the water even further down to the next place where somebody hasn't built their levees higher than they're supposed to. So the PRN folks, Prairie Rivers Network, have put together 2 specials talking about the levees that you're talking about and how people are breaking the rules and just making things worse for other people. We might even play some of this sometime on your show, Dave.
Yes, I've looked at it, but I haven't been able to get it up properly.
I watched listened to the first one. It was really, really good. Talking with people in a community, I'll actually give you one of the lines. A guy said, you know what? We really need to follow these rules. It's wrong to break the rules, but we really need to build that levee 3 feet higher. Complete misunderstanding of his own point.
And it throws the water onto others' farmlands, but it also throws water onto communities, so whole communities can be flooded. And the natural history people have been looking at that, and they've been taking out some of the bottomland agriculture and replacing it with nature that was there. And near Havana, Illinois, there's a large area which has been brought back into nature, and it's encouraging bird life and wildlife generally. And so let me.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay. Well, remember that we have a prairie that is alive with Leotris at the moment, and think about just visiting, or perhaps helping to remove teasel. And we'll try and put some links up here that we can't do a lot of video recording on our program because you would have to have the time that I speak to put the video in. So a link is better, and many people can handle a link, and this will go up on YouTube so that you can have a chance to see how you might be able to change the system. At the moment, I have to think about the idea of a narrow trail that would allow ambience and preservation on either side. And how do you do that? You may have to go to the community to get support so that the forest preserve and the conservation district can get your feeling and respond to it. If you aren't going to say anything, then there's no reason for doing anything different than a wide trail. So that means that even if you don't, that's not your forte in life, it's good if you can take the challenge and learn about it, and perhaps even speak to the point of preserving some of our last prairie ecosystem in this local community. And I think that's Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.